Hey there, FakeFox here. Welcome to my Nightblade trial healing build for the High Isle chapter. The Nightblade has become a very popular healer in trial content recently. It is mostly played as a very powerful Ultigen build. This meta build, with a few of its variations, is what I will show you in this video. Quick disclaimer before we start. This build is largely seen as optimal in high-end raiding at the moment. That does not mean it is optimal for everything. It might not fit your group setup. It is also quite demanding to play. This build is meant specifically for trials, but it does also work in dungeons. If you can heal 10 players, you can also heal 3, but it just isn't very optimal. So there is a chance that this is not the correct build for you or that you need to adjust it. I will, however, do my best to explain how you can do that. Okay, let's go. We start with the most important part of why this build works so well right away, namely the sets. We are using either Spellpower Cure or Olorim with either Saxiel Champion, Pillager's Prophet or Master Architect. We are playing one set on our healing staff while playing the other on our destruction staff. This allows us to additionally fit in Pearls of Elnefey and Nazaray. The idea is to generate as much ultimate as possible with Pearls of Elnefey, which is then powering Nazaray and Saxiel Champion, Pillager's Prophet or Master Architect, by giving us 5 ultimate every time we cast a healing skill while under 30% Magicka. The choice between Saxiel Champion, Pillager's Prophet or Master Architect depends on what the group can utilize the best. Pillager's Prophet becomes extremely powerful in encounters with many short burst phases and with a stacked group, because it has a pretty limited range. While Saxiel Champion is great when major force uptime is lacking in more consistent encounters and is less dependent on positioning. Master Architect is used when fights are under a minute, but is also the best choice for playing this build in dungeons. The choice between Spellpower Cure and Olorim is mostly personal preference. Spellpower Cure is mostly passive and easy to play, but loses uptime if we spend too much time on our back bar. Olorim requires more micromanagement and is highly dependent on group positioning, but allows us to technically be on our back bar as much as we like. However, we should be on our front bar as much as possible anyway, as I will explain later, so at least in my opinion, SPC is almost always the better set. Since SPC or Olorim is not synergizing with the rest of the build, it can technically be replaced if used by another support player in the group. The replacement sets need to be playable on one bar and should not stop us from casting non-stop healing, for example Powerful Assault or Martial Knowledge. Nazaray should only be replaced for another support monster set if it cannot be properly utilized for whatever reason. And Pearls of Elnefey should never be replaced. In terms of armor types, when we are playing with Saxiel Champion, we should use 2 rings, so we only have 1 heavy armor piece. For Nazaray, we can use light over medium if we need more sustain. Moving on to traits and enchantments. You might find it easier to sustain with higher resource pools. For that you can use Infused Prismatic on the head, chest and legs. Otherwise we use Divines with Magicka. On the jewelry, we want to be running 3 times infused with potion speed, because as a Nightblade we generate 10 ultimate when drinking a potion. So shorter potion cooldown equals more ultimate. For a budget version, you can use spell damage, weapon damage or Magicka regeneration. On the healing staff, we are using Decisive to generate even more ultimate, and that is also the reason why we want to be on our front bar as much as possible. For our back bar, we are then using Infused. Depending on our group, we might need to play a Crusher or Weakening enchantment on our back bar. Then we put Berserker on our front bar. Otherwise, we can just back bar Berserker and play whatever we like on our front bar. It basically doesn't really matter. Just go with Flame if you can't think of anything else that you could use. As our Mundus, we are using Ritual, since we deal absolutely no damage anyway and it increases our healing the most. We should be able to play with 64 attribute points in Magicka in most build variations, but you can put a few in health if you feel too squishy. 22k health is usually fine and I wouldn't go above 25k. As buff food, you will most likely not be able to sustain with just Magicka and health. You will see why when we talk about the rotation. So it's usually Magicka Health and Magicka Regeneration, or even Magicka and Magicka Regeneration. It would be ideal to play with Heroism Potions for even more Ultigen, but let's be real here, you would burn like 6,000 gold per minute. That's just a bit too much. If you need the buffs, use Essence of Spell Power, otherwise try Restoration Potions are really good with the added stamina sustain. But you can also just play with the looted potions in most content. They still give us 10 ultimate, and with the lower potion cooldown, they are actually way better on this build than others. Continuing with the race. With reduced potion cooldown, Argonian might seem like a good choice, but it is actually pretty awful, because it makes sustain completely inconsistent. Breton is the far better choice here, as it has the best and most consistent sustain. Altmer, Dunmer and Khajiit are also not bad, you will just need to build more regeneration. Nord would be the thematic choice, I guess, since it does have a Ultigen passive, but that is so weak it pretty much doesn't matter, and since the race is otherwise pretty bad, I would not recommend it. Okay, moving on to the champion points. As always, green CP doesn't matter except for Steed's Blessing, which I would highly recommend. You will be non-stop casting in between encounters to keep your Magicka low, so you will need all the movement speed you can get. In the blue CP, we use Soothing Tide and Swift Renewal to push our AoE healing over time, which covers pretty much everything relevant. Then we can use From the Brink or Enlivening Overflow, depending on what the other healer uses. And for the last remaining node, Hope Infusion gives us at least some minor heroism without the potions. For the red CP, I generally recommend Celerity. Expert Evasion and Slippery are also really good, since we are using stamina to heal. Situationally, stuff like Bracing Anchor or Sustained by Suffering can work really well, but more generally I would just fill up the remaining slots with Boundless Vitality, Ironclad and Rejuvenation. Now we come to the skills. First of all, we need to play one Siphoning skill. It needs to be on our front bar for increased Magicka and healing from the passives, and also because using it can generate 2 ultimate every 4 seconds. It should also be a healing skill. For boss encounters, I recommend Healthy Offering, because we can keep up permanent minor mending with it, and it's a decent burst heal. For trash fights, I recommend Power Extraction to debuff minor cowardice instead. Funnel Health is also an option, especially in dungeon content. Then we want to play Combat Prayer. Since we can spam it a lot with this build, we have an easy time keeping up minor Berserk, and it's a really good burst heal. The rest of our front bar we then just fill up with HOTS. I always use Echoing Vigor, so I have a stamina costing heal, and then Refreshing Path as it gives 15% more regen, and lastly, usually Illustrious Healing, sometimes Radiating Regeneration instead. For the front bar ultimate, I generally recommend Barrier. It passively gives 10% regen, and you still have a barrier just in case. Incapacitating Strike is also an option, so then we don't need to slot an assassination skill on our back bar, but it is worse for sustain. On the back bar we have Blockade to proc our enchantment, Magicka Steal and so on. We want to have the longer lasting Morph here, so we gain more time to spam healing, and it lines up better with the rest of our rotation. Then we need one assassination skill, so we give our group minor savagery when we deal critical damage. Having it only on the back bar is fine. The buff lasts 20 seconds and we should get enough crits on our back bar from Blockade and Weaving. We can use either Phantasmal Escape or Merciless Resolve. We don't need to actually use them, but we can if we have the time. Phantasmal Escape makes us very tanky in some encounters, otherwise Merciless Resolve is a bit of additional healing. Further, we want to have siphoning attacks to also have the siphoning passives on our back bar. It's technically not needed, but super annoying to play without. It's also a pretty good controllable sustain tool. And the last 2 slots are complete flex spots. It's ideal to have longer lasting skills here like Blood Altar, but we can also just use them for additional HOTS. And as the ultimate, we have Aggressive Horn, the ultimate we are actively using. Before we come to the rotation, let's quickly go over the passives. We of course want all of our class passives, healing and destruction staff, light armor, maybe medium or heavy if we're wearing it, then Undaunted, Magicka from Alliance War, racial passives, and lastly medicinal use from alchemy, and that is it. Now we come to the rotation. The goal of our rotation is to constantly keep our Magicka below 30% while casting as much healing as possible. We don't want to run completely dry because not casting on global cooldown lowers Ultigen, and we still need some resources to react to incoming damage with burst healing. But we also want to quickly get below 30% when a potion or something pushes us above. To achieve that, we need to play largely dynamic. So here's how I balance my sustain and prioritize my skills. I use Combat Prayer to lower my Magicka, my Magicka based HOTS to keep it consistent, and Vigor if I drop too low. I try to keep everything up as consistently as possible, but it's actually not a huge deal because I can just overcast the hell out of my HOTS anyway to generate ultimate. We also want to be casting our siphoning skill every 4 seconds if possible. The backbar skills we should not unnecessarily overcast though. If we have some that line up, we want to recast them together so we have less timers to worry about, otherwise we just recast everything as it runs out. If you were SPC, don't recast your entire backbar at once or otherwise spend more time than absolutely necessary on it. You also want to continue casting in between fights, so you start out with under 30% right away. Also, try making a habit out of casting Combat Prayer every time you take a potion. Potions push you above 30% Magicka, which is kind of annoying, but with Combat Prayer you can get below 30% again immediately. With siphoning attacks active, we can also use our weaving to control our sustain. And that is basically it. It's complicated to play, but there just isn't a lot to explain really. You just have to get used to it, and once you get into the flow it becomes really enjoyable, at least in my opinion. But let's also talk about when you want to use your ultimate. You can use your horn at 250 ultimate, obviously, but generally you want to line it up properly instead of just throwing it out on cooldown. Major vulnerability should be active, so you extend it, and depending on the second set you're wearing, there should either be a phase coming up where a longer Major Force or Major Slayer is needed, or if you're wearing Pillager's Prophet, players should actually need ultimate. This can be really difficult to coordinate since you can't really track how much ultimate everyone has. Ideally, the group should make a timed ulti dump and you use yours right after. A good raid lead should be doing most of the work for you, planning out the correct tactic and coordinating support ultimates. What we should always do when our ultimate is called though, together with a Colossus, is wait and check when the Colossus is actually used, so we don't accidentally proc Nazaray before the target has major vulnerability. If you don't have a coordinated enough raid, it can be difficult. You should at least track major vulnerability, and the rest is just kind of gut feeling. You can wait for the correct moment until you have 500 ultimate. After that it just becomes a waste, unless you have a really good reason to wait longer. Coordinating with our healing partner is also really important on this build. As I already mentioned, we profit from having longer duration skills on our backbar, and bar space isn't much of a problem, so we should be taking things like Blood Altar. The other healer's job is, at least to some degree, to enable our playstyle. We produce massive amounts of AoE healing, but our low Magicka pool makes us kind of inflexible. We also should be playing as few mechanics that keep us from non-stop casting as possible. So usually we should be the main group healer, while the other healer focuses more on complex mechanics and keeping alive players outside of the group. And with that, we are at the end of this build video. If you have any further questions, just put them in the comments and I will do my best to help you out. A build summary is also in the description, together with a few useful links. Thanks for watching and bye!